One of the most anticipated CX events each year is the announcement of the top 5 most favored offshore delivery locations based on research from Ryan Strategic Advisory's annual Front Office BPO Omnibus Survey. 2021's results are close at hand, and the CX Files caught up with 3 of the most respected customer experience veterans to discuss which locations they anticipate will be hot this year. You'll be hearing from Lian Rowlands, Dave Rumble, and Jesús Hoyos on what they see as the dynamic for offshoring in 2021 and beyond. Well, we're here for a special edition of the CX Files podcast where we're going to be talking with 2 of the most well-known veteran CX leaders in the world, Lian Rowlands and Dave Rumble, about their thoughts on how the most favored top 5 locations for CX delivery in the offshore are going to play out in 2021. Now, just for everyone's information, the Ryan Strategic Advisory Front Office BPO Omnibus Survey is currently in the field. We're finishing up our field work this week. And as we know, one of the most anticipated data points that we always look for is going to be who's going to form that top 5 most favored offshore series of destinations when it comes to CX delivery. Dave, I'm going to start with you for our lead-off question. From the standpoint of 2021, what are enterprise customer experience decision makers considering when they're selecting an offshore location? And if you could give some context about how this might be different relative to what they were thinking about before the pandemic started.
I think the principal effects of pandemic have, I think, really shifted people's and businesses' perceptions about the scale of operations, and you start to move the dialogue away from arbitrage and fixed commercial positions, which underlie, a significant number of these kind of sourcing decisions in terms of offshore locations. So I think really it's a kind of an upweight of the structures and the way the deal structures would work in terms of the capacity, the flexibility, and the capability to deploy in potentially into geographies that wouldn't necessarily have been into kind of tier 2 or even tier 3 recognized before. So there's an emerging theme of flex shoring, which is capturing this essence of looking at a very different load balanced estate. So it's moving away from, I think, hard decision making around the kind of the solely commercial positioning and an investment that's recoverable through arbitrage into something which is much more around the resilience and the sustainability of and interoperability of an operating model. So that emerging theme, I would say, is flex shoring, is what we would see, kind of most frequently coming front of mind for businesses in the sourcing choices they're making about geography.
Now, that's really good insight. And Lian, from your own standpoint, I know that you've worked with a lot of clients over the years, a lot of enterprises that have been searching for new, more innovative alternatives, and that's especially probably been the case in the last 12 months or so. Can you give me a sense amongst the enterprise contact center or CX decision makers you're speaking with, what are some of the more emerging or up-and-coming locations that they're championing these days in terms of looking to try and source new destinations for their own CX delivery?
I think what I'm seeing, certainly in a lot of the conversations that I'm having at the moment, are requirements less. People are, particularly within the enterprise, they're more willing to look at different locations, because one of the things that they're not as, I suppose, wedded to is the linguistic aspect of it. So the fact that things have to be multilingual and you need different languages in different locations, which has opened up different opportunities for people for these businesses to look at locations they might not otherwise have considered, because the requirement for a specific language might not be there anymore because it can be dealt with via technology or different ways of managing that particular problem. So I'm seeing lots of conversations around the Caribbean, lots of conversations around Mexico, those kind of locations, particularly as the business model has shifted. As a lot of the people that I'm talking to have moved online, they've opened up new markets for themselves. by opening up those new markets for themselves, whether they're the US, whether they're Canada, the need to actually follow the sun in that respect is, from a time perspective, is more important than the need for the link to follow linguistically.
No, really interesting. And I'm going to stay on that point with you for a second, Lian, because one of the things that we're picking up, at least in our research at Ryan Strategic Advisory the past couple of months, really since the outset of this year, is that the Caribbean is rapidly emerging as an alternative destination for particularly British and Irish enterprises. There's a lot of alignment. Obviously, the linguistics work the right way. It's not as far shore as people think. In fact, I recently did a bit of an analysis showing that it's actually faster to fly from London to Montego Bay or Kingston than it is to fly from London to Johannesburg or to Manila. Do you see some of these alternative locations then gaining traction in 2021?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I think ease of travel is going to remain with us as when travel opens up again, obviously, as we all hope it will. Yeah. I don't think we're going to go back to that kind of culture of, the crisscrossing the globe in the way that we were. I think ease of A to B, point-to-point travel is going to be much more important than it was. Particularly in the UK, we've got, the number of hubs that we've got with direct flights to the Caribbean is definitely playing into some of the conversations that I'm hearing around, okay, well, it's an 8-hour flight. So if it's 8 hours on a plane, that's great. That isn't, it's massively fundamentally different to a trip down to Johannesburg or a trip down to Durban or over to the Philippines. It's just much more easy to manage. And because of how some of the nature of the business is moving as well, it just seems to be front and center in a lot more conversations.
Yeah, I'm going to say, I'll just come in on there because I'll just say from a point of view of some of the stuff that we're seeing around location analysis, pandemic has definitely had an effect. So some of those larger, larger conurbations with mass transit infrastructure where people are likely to have higher, the infection rates are likely to be higher. So islands obviously have got a great opportunity to contain virus and manage the population. Areas that don't have huge mass transit, kind of systems and capabilities, the big urban spreads, are obviously now, providing opportunities to manage around, the concerns that people have got around pandemic. So there's a larger shift in terms of that, kind of location, much more structured approach to the dynamics of location sourcing. And it will take out some of those bigger tier 1 cities that we've been very familiar, as being, global sourcing destinations. So these big global metropolis of our offshoring and outsourcing destinations. And I think that will bring appeal of the Caribbean in, and smaller islands that would not necessarily have, featured. They might have featured as a holiday destination, but we now don't need to go to these places, and probably won't. So people who've been working in the leisure industry, who've had high customer experience standards, will get repurposed and they can deliver services virtually. So I think there's a bigger underlying shift.
Now, Dave, I want to stick with that underlying shift because if we think back in time to last year's Omnibus survey, the top 5 saw a bit of a slide from the Philippines. The Philippines had been number 1 in terms of favorability for 2018 and 2019. It fell from 1st to 3rd last year. I'm curious what you feel prompted that slide, and if you feel that the Philippines has to rejig or recalibrate its offshore offering as we move into 2021, because I think all three of us can agree from a public relations standpoint, it did face some challenges, especially when the pandemic started around this time 12 months ago.
Yeah. So I think it's one of these, you have, as India's experienced, massive influx into certain parts of those countries, and the ability for the industry to penetrate those countries and maintain a level and a tempo of business at a certain scale. So I think it's a question of, particularly for the Philippines, it's not just about the Philippines as a destination, but it's the types of services that it's providing. It's the access to the skills and the wider labour pool in terms of the populace there. So I don't think it's a concern for the Philippines unless it effectively deals with the change that's happening in the underlying structure of the industry. So it's been heavily reliant on one channel. It's been heavily reliant on certain sectors, and those things are changing, and those dynamic shifts are changing. So I think if the Philippines doesn't address that, then it could find itself move further down the list. But from a perspective, I don't think it's something that I would be particularly concerned about. They just need to evolve and move with the times in terms of the way the trends are playing out.
Now, evolution, I'm glad you use that term, because something that the Omnibus survey has done since we started this exercise in 2017 is that it's evolved quite a lot. One of the areas that it's evolved in is the linguistic makeup or the country makeup of the respondents. Yeah. And Lian, as we're moving into 2021, approximately half of the people answering the Omnibus survey will be from France, from Italy, Spain, Germany. I'm curious, in terms of your own thoughts, if this change in terms of how we've calibrated the survey will potentially favor more European nearshore delivery destinations, or potentially even emerging hubs that you might find in the Middle East or in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, I think, and again, I think linguistics is something that we're going to see a lot of change over the course of the next 12 months. Because there is that desire to have native speakers, particularly in Western Europe, so French, German, Spanish, Italian. And again, particularly as retailers in particular have developed so that they're now throwing their net wider in terms of, their customer base. So they're looking for those the ability to serve customers in all of those languages. But I think one of the things that we'll see happening more often is that increasingly technology will handle some of those translations. So already we're seeing, whether it's live chat or bots or various different pieces of translation technology sitting in between a customer who is typing in Spanish and an agent who only speaks French, and that translation doesn't have to be done by the agent themselves. So whilst there will be that requirement from a voice perspective to be able to manage those languages, actually as technology increases and as we see it move, I genuinely think that the multilingual aspect won't be as important as it has been, which will open up the different consideration set, to Dave's point before, around the skill set of the country in terms of what its BPO providers can provide. So is it technical support? Is it HR support? Is it knowledge and social, or is it pure customer service voice? So I think they will become more important when choosing your offshore location than necessarily the languages that you can get within those locations.
Very interesting take. Well, we're coming to the end of our chat today, and I'm going to preface the next question by just mentioning that we have 620 enterprise CX decision makers that are answering the survey. It's the biggest one that we've done so far, and already the interim data cuts are showing some very, very fascinating trends. But when it comes to the top 5 offshore locations, we've got over 50 different countries that we've asked our respondent base to evaluate. And I'll start with you, Lian. If you were to think about the fact that we have got this, quite frankly, plethora of different spots that these decision makers, people that are in the know, are going to be ranking in terms of their preferences and providing their evaluations on, what do you anticipate in 2021 the most favored offshore locations are going to be?
Which, whatever I say could go horribly wrong. But I'll say it anyway.
It might not.
I think, interestingly, I still think India is going to remain, the number one, or at least there or thereabouts. I think some of the recent relaxation of the regulations in India that we've seen over the last sort of 6-8 weeks, in terms of how outsourcers are governed there, is going to open up some of the capabilities in India, particularly to some potentially smaller and medium-sized providers who we'll see enter the market. I kind of have a feeling that now that they don't have to give static IP addresses and they don't have to, register every office, etc. So that kind of regulation, relaxation, I think will really help India in terms of keeping up. I think the nearshore locations, I think you're still definitely going to see some traction within the nearshore locations. So Poland, Bulgaria, lots and lots of conversations around Poland and Bulgaria. And then I'm going to stick with the Caribbean. I think as people's business models expand and we see people serving the US, we see particularly UK companies, we see them serving the US customers more, we see them serving Russian customers more, we see them serving, and we sort of see this more globalization of the customer base of these companies. I do think we're going to see the Caribbean move up, particularly to serve the US market.
Great stuff. Okay. Thanks, Lian. Dave, your thoughts? Lian has said that she feels India will retain the top spot. What's your prediction for 2021?
Yeah, this is where I'm going to ask you, Peter. You're going to have to do some compound maths on this and add some locations together. So I'm going to say South Africa is going to be number one.
Okay.
And I'm tempted to say that we'll see potentially Malaysia and Poland drop out the top five. I think if we can aggregate some countries together, I think the Balkans is particularly interesting as a nearshore, a developing nearshore location for European language. And obviously, I mean, you can almost include Romania in that group, but probably not. But the emerging ones of Serbia, Kosovo, and some of those emerging markets. And then I'm going to call, if you aggregate sub-Saharan Africa, particularly for Francophone and Anglophone as sourcing destinations, there's a lot of work going on in the impact sourcing space, which I think is starting for all the right reasons to start to get some traction now in the wider sourcing market. So there are some great case studies coming out of Kenya. There's obviously the stuff in the recent investments in Ghana from Google and the like. So I think we'll start to see some of those countries kind of climb the ladder. But I'm hoping that there are going to be some new faces, but I want to call South Africa at number one above India for the first time.
For the first time, exactly. Okay, cool. Well, thanks very much, Lian, Dave. This has been a fascinating discussion as always. Watch out for the top five. We will be announcing in April where the top five will be placed in the broader elements of our survey. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure as always, and look forward to catching up on future podcasts.
Hello, this is Mark Hillary, Peter's co-host. You might be asking why Peter introduced Jesús Hoyos and he wasn't actually there on the discussion. Well, Jesús had a problem getting onto Zoom at the same time as everybody else, but immediately after that call, Peter called him just to ask a couple of questions and include him in the discussion. So let's go straight to that part of the interview now.
Now, Jesús Hoyos, you're one of the more experienced veterans when it comes to looking at the whole CX dynamic when we're considering a United States angle. One of the things that we've been picking up in our research at Ryan Strategic Advisory, certainly in the last few omnibus surveys, is that there's been a lot of interest amongst American CX executives to explore the nearshore, but not necessarily the traditional nearshore with what we would have seen perhaps with Colombia and Mexico, but certainly some emerging alternatives of late. At the same time, Colombia and Mexico continue to perform strongly. What are some of the nearshore destinations that you see most up and coming and most relevant to US and potentially even Canadian and Spanish contact center buyers in 2021?
Yeah, I would like to, go beyond countries and go into regions or clusters, because of course, I see Costa Rica, San Jose, I see Colombia, but I want to focus more in Medellin. I want to say, Peru, but probably outside Lima. Okay, definitely in Argentina when you look at, outside, Buenos Aires. But it's not so much of the region and the hub that you see, but it's more the capabilities that you have in that particular, city or hub that you can bring people not only to do the traditional CX for do, the call center, do chat, do BPO, but extend that to produce, low-code apps, to be able to expand, the experience and be able to produce, applications. So what I see a lot is, banks, doing alliances with universities. Universities are doing alliances with traditional, inshore, outshore, organization. So I think it's a mix, and now because of the pandemic, it could be anywhere, anytime. But whoever is providing that infrastructure, security of the data, and be able to provide the skill set to go beyond the traditional outsourcing, inshore, outshore, or the as we know the call center, we need to expand, because now CX, you need to define it, and you need to look for that organization who's going to partner with you to go beyond the call center or the traditional communications, because now we can communicate with Teams, we can communicate through Zoom, we can communicate through events, so whoever is producing content, is producing applications, low code, no code, those are the key areas that you want to focus. So I see San Jose, I see Medellin, I see Querétaro, okay? From that point of view, I see as well Monterrey, okay? Not only your traditional call center, but the expanding of the actual, experience.
One of the things we've been picking up on in our research, especially the last several months, has been a renewed interest in the border communities along the U.S.-Mexico frontier. Is this something that you see as relevant in terms of communities such as Mexicali, Tijuana, and Ciudad Juarez emerging as potential contact center hubs for servicing the United States?
I see Tijuana a lot. It comes a lot. Not so much the other ones, but I see, the multicultural aspect. I mean, is something that is really important. And I see Tijuana a lot coming up. Actually, I was supposed to be in Tijuana this week, speaking to the call center community about exactly that, how to expand, the traditional call center into CX. Okay, but I see Tijuana a lot.
So, Jesus, one of the other things that we're picking up on in terms of the United States has been a renewed interest, or perhaps a refreshed interest, in South Africa. One of the elements that I've noticed, especially in my travels, again, as you say, when we were allowed to travel, was on the last few visits to South Africa, an increasing number of U.S. contact center executives, both from the outsourced side and from the enterprise side, looking to leverage communities in that country from an English language standpoint. Is this something that you've been picking up on as well in regards to demand for alternative English locations in the United States?
Yeah, actually, because of the so many languages that you can find in South Africa, and I have worked in South Africa as well, but it was the reverse. South Africa was looking for talent in the Americas to deploy, a call center outsourcing process. The English language, if you need to find it, but again, it's not only the language, but the capabilities that you have. And I've seen, especially like Durban, if I'm not mistaken, they have a lot of schools, a lot of, momentum to develop the skill set, not only to develop the English language, but be multicultural, and most important, be able to expand the customer experience. And this is very key what I've seen, because the last couple of years I've seen that in EMEA with South Africa and in the Americas. How can I not only do traditional CX, but how can I expand that? This is the funny thing. I started to see that before the pandemic. Okay, so it's a trend that's picking up. Of course, with the pandemic, it's accelerating this process.
Jesus, we're going into the end of our survey. We're literally days away from the completion of all the field work. If you were to think about 2021 and what you believe will be the most favored offshore location amongst CX buyers around the world in the key demand markets, what would your prediction be?
Medellin, Colombia.
You think Colombia will be on top?
Yeah, but I want to be specific, Medellin. Because it's the whole aspect of combining government, the private industry, schools, the call center industry, and go beyond a CX. You've seen many startups deploying their operations in Colombia, because they have the talent over there. And that startup, mentality is eager. You see it every day in Medellin, So that's something that definitely that I will see. And I won't be surprised in the future, that as we expand, and it might not be cost effective, but it might be talent effective. I see Miami coming up like that as well. Cities that are promoting to bring that talent and expand that talent within the CX ecosystem. Again, I'm going beyond call center and messaging and BPO, but expanding into events, expanding into software development, all combining. That you get everything together in one outsourcing. That's why I see Medellin to be one of those hot zones in Latin America, in the Americas.
Jesus, if you were to pick for 2021, what do you think will be the most favored offshore destination when it comes to CX delivery amongst the respondents to the 2021 Front Office BPO Omnibus Survey?
I will say Colombia, and it doesn't matter. There's different cities, but that you can pinpoint. But Colombia is putting together a good approach of government, private industries, universities, and outsourcing companies, BPO companies, to develop that talent. And I want to be very specific. What I mean by developing that talent is you go beyond having bilingual people, providing call center services or voice services or chat, the traditional CX channels. But what I see here is be able the capabilities to go beyond those traditional CX channels, where you can definitely produce applications, where you can manage events on-site or remote events. And I see a trend of many of the startups, global startups, they are coming back to Colombia to get that talent and expand that. So, and at the same time, when you look at the traditional, call center vendors, they're busy in Colombia as well. So you see that investment globally in Colombia because of that. And again, I want to make the distinction that is the extended CX, not the traditional channel, but the extended CX.
Great. Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much. So we've got one panelist saying India, one South Africa, and one Colombia. So we're covering a lot of territory there. Thank you very much.
No problem, man.
Thanks for downloading the CX Files podcast. If you have a moment, please give us a star rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, because this really helps other people to find the podcast. If you have any suggestions for future guests, or ideas, people, or topics, then please just find myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan on LinkedIn and send a suggestion.